I'm Dave Wiesdock, Sage of Creative Scaffolding.
And I'm Jen West, Professional Rebel of Delight.
And this is Shadow Casting. Hey Jen, how are you today?
I'm doing very well today. How about yourself?
I'm doing great. Are you excited to talk about our quote of the day?
I love our quote of the day. What are you going to hit me with today?
All right. So this is a quote from one of my favorite authors, speakers, and just kind of personalities right now out in the world. And it's Brené Brown. And it's a really short quote. And it's, if you own this story, you get to write the ending. And that's it.
Yeah, short and sweet. I like it a lot. All right. Say it one more time.
Okay. If you own the story, you get to write the ending.
Oh, yeah. It's just direct and it brings up all these ideas. I mean, just story.
Oh, yeah. So
I just kind of want to sit with story.
So, I approached this from the perspective, let's say, of personal responsibility. And I really liked the idea of the story because everything is a story in a way. The stories we tell ourselves in our mind, the stories that we listen to when someone shares an experience, the story of the past, the future, the present even. And our mind really gravitates towards stories. There's whole courses out there, even in the business world, about communication and storytelling, like how to tell a story. And I think it's because stories connect us and create a empathetic bond around something, and they help us remember details. And there's this part of it where, and I like this first part where it's like, you have to own the story. You have to own that part. You have to take responsibility of the stories within yourself. So when we're talking about shadow casting and projecting our shadow out into the world, we talk about ourselves and the part that we have to own. And so I feel like really the first part of this is leaning into the fact that we create our own stories, and until we can kind of take a step back, breathe, and almost this kind of idea of like metacognition, stepping outside the story that is within us.
Yeah. So if I'm breathing into that story, there are stories that, if we're talking from a personal experience, we don't have control over. Like maybe as children, that story was dictated to us. People were training us, teaching us how to be. And so that story is kind of set. But then once we're an adult, it's like, what do we do with that story? How do we take ownership of it and cultivate ourselves at this point? And I think that's what Brené is getting at. It's like, yeah, you have this story, but now can you take it for yourself and then write what's coming after? Are you going to complete the story, or is the story going to complete you?
Right. The way that you kind of look at it is, some stories we create and some stories are given to us. Expectations, societal, I'll even say like limitations, the stories that our parents had that they then pass on to us. And so sometimes we have to own the stories that are inside of us. And the reason we have to own that is because the stories are how we interact with the world outside of us and around us. When we're dealing with our kids, oftentimes the stories of how our parents parented us, or the stories that we created as kids of, oh, when I become a parent, I'll do that better. All these expectations and inner stories that we have about how we want to act in the world, sometimes they're subconscious. They're there, but we're not aware of them. And so really this first part is kind of an awareness exercise. It's, where are these stories at in our lives? And is it a story that creates an autopilot for us? Or is it a story that creates awareness for us? Is it a story that we can become in the present moment with? Because when we're truly in the present moment, I think that's how we get to that second part of the quote, writing the ending. It's the ability to be aware of, own the story, and then recognize that you can change the story. You can't change where the story got up to that point. But if you can own the story from a singular point of being present, then you can change how the story ends. Going to that example of the parenting, if you have the story of how you're supposed to parent or be in the world as a parent with your kids, and you're using that story and that's not what's working with your own child, and you can recognize that and own that, then you can go, okay, well, how can I write this differently? How can I change how the story is impacting my life? Because just like when we talk about other things like play, like serious versus sincere play in our previous podcast, I don't want the idea of a story to be a bad thing. I think stories, again, help us communicate with others, help us create a sense of empathy and connection. And it's when we can take ownership of the story that's where the real power comes in.
Yeah, as I think about the story, I'm put into the mindset, of just reading a book? Am I reading the book just to enjoy the drama or enjoy the comedy or whatever it is that I'm reading? Or am I thinking critically about the characters and what roles they're playing and the difference between a story that I'm just sitting in as a bystander, or does it become a choose your own adventure where you're picking the direction it goes? And I think that's the shift we have to make as we move along if we want to change the story. And unlike a choose your own adventure where the story is still written, it becomes ours. The minute that we stop enjoying the ride and flowing downstream and just sit in it and look at it, like you said, find those unconscious pieces and then start rewriting or adapting, growing, playing.
Right. It's like, are you flowing with the story in the sense of, are you allowing the story to carry you through life almost on autopilot? Or are you happening to life? Are you choosing the story as it's unfolding before you? That's where I think, again, the real meat to this is we often almost autopilot backwards to a story because it's easier than trying to take ownership of where we're at in that story and choosing. It doesn't even have to be an ending. I think the quote is poetic in that way with Brené Brown saying the ending, but it's just even the next step, the next act in the play, the next chapter even. It's, you can own that. And I think often what happens is when we get kind of trapped in that shadow esqueness, when we think that something is happening to us or at us, that's the story. That's the uncontrolled story, let's say. That's the world is against us, the universe is against me, the fill in the blank, whatever we tell ourselves to almost justify what is happening to us or at us. We object from control in our lives and from responsibility in our lives. And this isn't easy. This is a kind of a challenge, even for me. It's the ability to go, okay, that's the story my mind is telling itself because that's the story that it kind of reinforces. And when I can become aware of that story and own that story and go, okay, this is the story my mind creates because that is what is easier, then it goes, well, what else is possible then? How can I change the story? So this brings me to an analogy that you and I talked about a while ago. I don't know if you remember this analogy or not, but it was the tapes. And it's so for everyone listening, I had this epiphany a while ago that there's these tapes that play in the back of our head. When a certain situation happens, we get that extra bill, or in the business setting, something isn't working that has always worked before in the past. It's that tape in our head. I'm listening to a recording of what someone has told me or what I've witnessed myself. And so we're allowing the story to create the narrative as it's unfolding before us. When we become aware of that, then you can take the tape out or you can record over it. You can change the narrative as it's happening. You own and write the ending. Taking this to a really simple example, I kind of keep harping on like the movement and the becoming a creature of movement, like you and I like to talk about. There's the story in my head of, okay, well, I'm more of the intellectual. I'm more of the mind guy. And so that's the story that I've owned. That's the tape that's playing in my head. What if I take out that tape? What if there's no tape? Although that might be a whole different podcast. But what if I change the tape? What if I rewrite or re-record what's on that tape? What if I create it as a sense of possibility or a question? Instead of when this next situation happens and I go, well, that just justifies the tape that's already playing in my head. What if I go, okay, let's ask a question here. Let's get curious. Let's lean into what else is possible. Where are there other pieces of information that we can put together? How can we change the story that's unfolding before us?
With that tape, the tapes was probably made decades before, at least a decade before, and it's been running over and over and over and over. And if you read a book where the character kept making the same mistake over or kept telling themselves the same thing all the way to the end, and the character at the beginning was the character at the end, you probably wouldn't like the book that much. And really, some of the things that happen to us are that break in the character where something goes wrong, or they go on an adventure, or that mentor comes hero journey style, and it breaks the tape. Like, it doesn't work. It's unknown at this point, and the character can't keep acting the same way they always did. And so that's an unconscious break of the story where the character changes, and we're taking it to a level where we're looking at it instead and choosing to say, what is that tape? What has been playing? And how do I change it so that my life is changed? I'll write a new tape. I remember when you brought this up and you said, and I'm using old software. Why am I using cassette tapes? Why not an MP3 player?
Exactly. It's once you get into this idea, then it just grows. Like we were talking about the cassette versus like recording an MP3. Why can't I make it more adaptable? You know, tape is an archaic technology at this point, unfortunately or fortunately. So we have different software, different technology, and we can even create sound bites that can overlap with each other and play with each other. And that's where the context of this really kind of gets fun, because again, I'm going to sound, I guess, a bit like a broken record, but again, it bleeds into everything. So if you start to create question and possibilities with one tape or one soundbite that you're listening to, that kind of starts to go into other areas of your life. And so you start to create this space where you do write the story and you own it. And I think that's a huge part of this is you have to own the story. You have to take charge of the story you're in. And I think oftentimes we're so used to just reading the story and reading as the character changes. And unfortunately, like in the hero's journey, sometimes the signs aren't as obvious. Sometimes the mentor breaking the old tape or the old way of thinking isn't as clear cut. It's not as concise as you can put into a book. It's something that happens over time. And so you have to learn to become aware of when these tapes show up. And then you have to take the action. You have to make the decision. And it's not just a one-time decision. You have to constantly rewrite and rework that tape because it's built in your neural pathways, kind of going into the science of this for a second. When you own the story and then you begin writing the ending, you're rebuilding neural pathways into a different path. And that takes time. That takes consistency. That tape that you weren't owning before had time, had consistency and momentum because it was an easy tape to listen to. It was an easier book to read. And when you have to sit in the driver's seat and write your own story and figure out the ending and the next chapter that's unfolding, that takes some work and some consistent effort.
Yeah, and the rough drafts aren't going to be that great at the beginning. I was actually thinking about your tape and making a remix. And so you have the old story that's, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough. What if we try something new? I'm not good enough. And have the old tape start to fade out where the new one starts bringing up more curious, interesting questions instead of, why am I always so bad at something? It's like, what would happen if I tried this?
Yeah, and that's a great analogy too. It's kind of like everyone has a favorite song, favorite CD, favorite something that they've listened to, and eventually it gets old listening to it. But for some reason, the stories that are like passively activating in our lives are happening, we don't get tired of listening to until there's something newer to listen to. When we find that question, well, like you were bringing up the I'm not good enough. And then you're like, well, wait a minute. What if I did have the confidence to feel like I'm good enough? What if I did think that I was capable of handling X situation? Then it becomes this, then your brain kind of gets interested because there's a new sound, there's a new soundtrack. And for a while, it might be a cacophony or it can be this cool overlay of sounds, but you got to consistently feed that new sound, that new interest. For me, that's always kind of the challenge is learning to feed that new interest, that new sense of self and story, because it does take an active part and a decision in your life to do that.
Yeah. And finding that tape is really hard. I remember I was in a job that I didn't want to be in anymore. It wasn't horrible. It had just got rote, been there, done that, boring. I wanted something else. And I had created over a couple months this tape that said, I don't want to go to work. I don't want to go to work today. And I didn't know it was there. And then I quit the job and I didn't have a job. And the tape would pop up saying, I don't want to go to work. And I'm not going to work. What the? And I started to realize that it just kind of ran there whenever I didn't feel like doing something. It's like, I don't want to go to work. And it became funny because I had a space that it didn't make any sense. And so catching those stories and starting to make them funny. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Adding humor to it. Absolutely. Humor is a great way to kind of lean into that too. It's like, oh, there's that story again.
Yeah. Yeah. Brené is so great. She just gives us a short little story and then riff on it. I'd love to hear what our listeners think about. Like, do they know what's a tape or a story that they have that they would like to explore?
Yeah, that's a great point. If you guys want to share in the comments the story that you're exploring, or how maybe there was a story in the past that you recognized and that you were able to change the ending or the next chapter, we'd love to hear from you. And please give this video, wherever you're listening to it, a like, comment, share. We'd love to hear from our audience. And thanks for listening, everyone.
Yeah. Until next time.
Bye.